Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Break the Rules. I'm your host, Lev Polyakov, and it is an immense pleasure to be back here with the one and only Dr. Jason Reza Jorjani, one of the preeminent thinkers of our time, somebody who I look up to in all kinds of ways, whether it comes to UFOs, whether it comes to archaeology, history, philosophy. There is no person I know who is as intriguing as you, Jason. And it is a great pleasure to have this Ask Me Anything session where we get to hear from our wonderful patrons, patreon.com/breaktherules. Thank you guys so much for supporting the show. And we are going to get right into it right now. Happy Cetacean. Dr. Jorjani, there's a striking difference in scale across UFO reports, from small orbs of light to compact D-Glock-style craft possibly tied to breakaway civilization technology, to massive sightings like the pyramidal UFO in Ingo Swann's Penetration or UK Pentridge incident, to Jeff Nutelli's congressional testimony about city block-sized red squares. Do you think the reports of these enormous craft are more likely to be a part of a disinformation campaign, while smaller technological craft represent the actual phenomenon? Or are there different tells for determining what constitutes disinfo versus reality?
First of all, it's always a pleasure to be back with you, my friend. And it's been far too long. That's been my fault. I've been incredibly busy. Anyone who's following me on my Substack can see that I've been putting out essay after essay on Substack. Who isn't following me there should do so. And my new book is also just about to come out. So I've been finishing that and trying to get it to press.
It's a Thenosis.
Yep. It's a comprehensive study of death, the afterlife realm, rebirth, and various psychotronic technologies that are relevant to regaining greater agency over navigating what the Tibetans call the Bardo state. So to our patron's question here, Happy Cetacean. Great ID, by the way. And electrogravitic technology is highly scalable. And I say this partly based on research, the kind of research that factored into my tome on UFOs, Closer Encounters. But I also say it based on personal experience. I've seen a schematic of one of these things, and the most remarkable feature of it was how scalable it was. In other words, the electrogravitic energy system that would be behind the propulsion of the craft was modular. You know, you could put a bunch of these next to each other like pizza slices, you know, and you could go from an energy and propulsion source that could power something the size of a car to something that could power an aircraft carrier sized object. So one thing I think that people need to keep in mind is that because of the radically different nature of 0-point energy-based propulsion, the core drive for these craft is highly scalable. And so it can power a very small craft, or it can power some of these football field-sized UFOs, which are definitely a real thing. And not all of them are being built by the deep state or breakaway civilization. The Nordics definitely have some of these huge triangles where when you look up, you know, and see it at night, it blocks out the stars over like a football field's scope and scale. But another point that I wanted to make in response to that question is that I think there is a legitimate distinction to draw between these plasma orbs that can be very small versus nuts and bolt craft. Because clearly the plasma balls are a thing, and they appear to interact with consciousness. Whether they're being produced by a certain technology or whether they are an exotic life form, I think remains an open question. And it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. There could be plasma technology that interacts with consciousness, and there could also be life forms that, as John Keel suggested in his decades of research on UFOs, could shapeshift. They could have a kind of plasmatic or ectoplasmic substrate, and then they could take on various other potentially deceptive forms like a chameleon, or like a shape-shifting octopus. And in chapter 7 of Closer Encounters, I associate that kind of thing more with a kind of true non-human intelligence that exhibits behavioral properties typical of the trickster archetype.
And his second question is, how do we actually get to the future you're advocating for? Political revolutions can be co-opted. Disclosure is limited to an ontological Overton window at the population's mental capacities. A psychic school seems like it would be targeted until destroyed. Or am I expecting too much from the humans and not enough from humanity's allies?
The problem with this question, or rather, with how the question is framed, is that it's coming from a majoritarian outlook. I hate to say this, especially so early in our conversation, but I'm really just belaboring a point that I've made time and time again, both in my writings and in numerous podcasts. And that's that there is absolutely no way that the vast majority of humanity is going to be able to navigate disclosure. It's impossible. If you think from a majoritarian perspective, in other words, if your interest is in saving the largest number of people and securing, relatively humane, sustainable conditions for the majority of Earth's population, you're going to have to accept that a reset is necessary that pushes us back by hundreds, if not thousands of years, and that sequesters singularity level technology and all of the modern technological developments that inevitably and quickly lead to convergence into a singularity. You're going to have to sequester all of that away from the vast majority of the population and reset the world to a kind of almost pre-industrial, quasi-feudal, neo-agrarian society, and one whose ideological underpinning is probably traditionalism, some kind of perennialist, convergence, or let's say more perennialist modus vivendi and coexistence of the so-called great world religions, which I think mostly are absolutely terrible and not great at all, like mainstream Judeo-Christianity and Islam, or Indian Deva worship. So, look, if your interest is to save as many people as you can, that's the only option. If you want disclosure, which inevitably also means navigating the technological singularity in a way where we ultimately achieve parity with the people and entities on the other side of the UAP phenomenon, then there's no way that you can secure the lives, let alone the prosperity of the majority of people on the planet. You're going to have to create conditions for an extreme minority of people who are psychologically prepared and who have the requisite cultivation of consciousness to both grapple with the very dark realities that true disclosure would expose them to, and also to have the ethical fabric that would be requisite for successfully navigating the technological singularity. And so the proper framing of the question is, by what social and political means can an extreme minority of people be empowered to define further development, the trajectory of further development on the planet at large? And we can come back to this question, and I'm sure there'll be other people who are going to pose, questions similar to this one. But very briefly, let me just say that this is a particular concern to me now. Okay, I've written 15 books. The last of them, which we just advertised, is an extremely metaphysical text. So I think people should expect me to take a much more practical turn in the near term. And one of the things that I'm starting to do right now is to try to see if I can really concretely engage people within the American deep state, within the corporate military industrial intelligence complex, to see whether some kind of a coup d'etat is possible. Because quite frankly, if there isn't some coup within the deep state, and there isn't some kind of a reorganization of the relationship between the American deep state and, I was going to say the United States government, but let's just say the formal public governmental structure of this country, then we're fucked. It's absolutely hopeless. The only way forward, the only way, even for a minority of prepared people to have anything like real disclosure, is for there to be a coup within the system of this country, or the Anglosphere generally, because frankly, I mean, Canada, Australia, even the UK really no longer have any substantive political sovereignty in distinction from the United States. So there needs to be a coup within the Anglospheric deep state. And the main thing that's been lacking to catalyze that is some philosophical framework, not to say some, ideological discourse that would, be the justification and the basis for the programmatic restructuring of our society through this coup d'etat. And so I think that the gentlemen who are in a position to start to bring some of this technology into the public sector and to reveal what they know about our true position in the cosmos, and who want out of this extremely oppressive, illegal, black budget project system that they're inside of, need to start seriously considering what philosophical framework is going to make that possible for them.
Now we're going to go to one question here from our good friend Spectral Valkyrie. Hi, Professor. You remember many past lives. Have you ever tracked down anyone you had a past life interaction with and reconnected?
First of all, hi, Alora. Good to see you, or rather to read you. Look, it's not many past lives. In fact, I think that one of the most deplorable things about the human condition is how we are made to forget the majority of our biography. You see this in Plato's Republic, in the myth of the image of the deceased being forced to drink from the river Lethe, or meaning forgetfulness or concealing. In my latest book, Thanosis, I talk about how there's good empirical evidence and testimony for something like this actually being part of the afterlife process, that in effect, we're forced to forget. It's not like some accidental thing that happens, okay? It's part of this system that we're put through. And of course, it's a control mechanism because, if someone's put into an extreme state of dissociation and amnesia every time they're reborn, it's going to be a lot easier to control them than if they had access to all of their memories of having figured various things out in previous lives. Plus, their access to an uncorrupted, unperverted account of human history and all the various things that have been done to construct manipulative ideologies and retarded religious belief systems and so forth. So it's one of the most lamentable things about the human condition that we can't remember, most of our past lives. I have had extremely fragmentary, what appears to be, rather, I should say, fragmentary memories from, I don't know, maybe a handful, 6, maybe 5, 6 or 7, maybe previous incarnations. A few of them very vivid, like several of them. Very vivid, where the fragments can be sort of pieced together with some extrapolation and speculation, and where they seem to map on, in some cases, to historical personages. So it's very few. Have I tracked down? Yeah, tracked down is not exactly the right way to put it. I mean, it has it's burst into my life. I have been confronted with extremely dramatic and in some cases deeply unsettling encounters with people from more than one past life of mine. And I don't necessarily wish it upon anybody. It can be a very difficult situation to navigate. So often I criticize the moral assumptions that are packed into a concept like karma. Because I think there's a great deal of evidence, and I lay this out in my latest book as well. There's a great deal of evidence that there's no intrinsic moral order in the cosmos. So karma as some kind of a system of like, retribution for past actions, or, some kind of a tally or balance sheet that's moral in nature and that, meets action with reaction across lifetimes, that I don't think is a tenable conception. But I do think that karma, in the sense of bonds between people across lifetimes and the binding of people by their deep emotional entanglement with and commitments to, or shared trauma with people from their past lives, is something that carries across lifetimes, sometimes multiple lifetimes. And it can be very difficult and destabilizing to deal with. It could actually take your life apart completely.
There was, before we get to the other one, a stream that we had with this gentleman who purported to have seen certain things, not even in this past life, but in the in-between realms. And that is also something that piques my interest as far as, is this something that he was tricked by, or are there ways that people who meditate a lot can actually see something that is objectively real and know that they're not being played by somebody?
Yeah, well, it's hard to know, Lev, because the thing is, as best as I've been able to tell, the people who like to consider themselves angels and who administer the afterlife realm are themselves manipulators and deceivers. And so the distinction there is a difficult one to draw.
Now we're going to get to the tectonic cobra. Dr. Jorjani, after reading almost all your work and seriously comprehending your project, I am haunted by it in everything that I do. As a young person trying to figure out my life, how do I manage the weight of the knowledge and radical responsibility that comes with being initiated into your philosophy with, for example, finding a way to pay the bills existing in contemporary society?
The fact that this, I was going to say young person, is able to even frame the question in these terms shows that you already are grappling with the responsibility. That you're even able to formulate this as a problem and recognize the weight of it means that you're not being crushed by whatever it is that you have had to think through in working your way through my corpus. So that's very promising. Yeah, so what I would offer as practical advice, and here the proviso, physician, heal thyself, probably applies. In other words, I should probably listen to this advice myself more than I do. But as practical advice, I would say you need to find ways to ground yourself in practical endeavors, activities that are not just intellectual and that prevent you from going off into flights of abstraction or staring too consistently and too deeply into a spiritual abyss. Like you need to find some kind of craft or some area where you might pursue or cultivate a talent, or where you enjoy developing something. I don't know, music, artwork, some kind of craft work, it could be agricultural cultivation, something that grounds you in this world that's habit forming and that you can do on a regular basis to keep yourself from basically drowning in the abyss of existentially disturbing ideas. Okay, so that's what I would say. But again, the very fact that you can think about this problem in these terms, to me, is very promising. I'll be quite honest with you that there have been people who were, in some cases quite close to me, and in other cases colleagues of mine that I worked with for a while, who read some of my work and frankly lost their minds. They went insane or had some kind of a psychotic break. So you're sounding like you're in pretty good shape. Keep at it, but find a craft or a hobby or something that, that can keep you grounded in life.
Excellent. Next we have over here from Bonds and Dragons. Are you a moral relativist?
I draw a fundamental distinction between morality and ethics, very much as Nietzsche did. So morality to me means like a code of do's and don'ts and a criterion for assessing rights and wrongs. And it's very obvious if you study history and theology that morality is totally relative. It's relative in terms of various cultures, it's relative in terms of historical epochs, and it's radically relative in terms of divergent theological doctrines. Morality in that top-down sense, like, the Ten Commandments, or, Sharia based on the revelation of the Quran, or, the laws of Manu in Hinduism is a moral system. These moral systems are from the top down or from the outside in, right? They come from like the heavenly order or from the gods or from the God through the angels of the God, right? And they come from the outside in and are supposed to be impressed upon your soul, and you're supposed to be obedient to them and to those who revealed them. That's not what ethics is at all. Ethics is about the cultivation of ethos. The word ethos in Greek means character. It means character or constitution. So, for example, we can also talk about the ethos of a people. The ethos of a people is the true constitution of the people, not what's written on a piece of paper. Okay? So, for example, the United States Constitution, which is in tatters right now and has been for a long time, certainly since the deep state was created. I mean, effectively, they undermined the Constitution fundamentally at that point, around about 1947 to 50. But then recently as well, with all the political correctness policing and woke cancel culture, fundamental violations of the First Amendment, threats to the Second Amendment, so on and so forth, our Constitution's in tatters, the written piece of paper. The question is, what state the Constitution in the sense of ethos is in? What state is the American ethos in? So you can talk about a constitution of a people and or a constitution on an individual level. And Martin Heidegger argued very persuasively, if you ask me, in Being and Time, how the constitution of an authentic individual is connected to the ethos of a people and how these mutually sort of reinforce each other. Okay, so ethos is the cultivation of character. There also, it's relative. There is no universal ethos, right? Different individuals have different characters, and those are shaped by societies, cultures, or in the largest scale, civilizations with a divergent ethical constitution. So ultimately, I think it's important on an existential level to have an ethos. In other words, you're not going to be able to cultivate your psyche in any substantive and sophisticated way if you're a person lacking in ethos. And also, a society that lacks ethos is going to come apart at the seams. Any society that's bound together only by written law or by treaties or conventions or whatever is not going to live for very long at all. Okay, that's not a real nation. And it also is not capable of generating a true sovereign principle that could be embodied by a head of state in a real sense. So having ethos is important, but is ethos relative in the sense that, there are competing ethics? Absolutely. And there's no way out of that. And I think Nietzsche was absolutely right about it, that, we are in a perspectival war between individuals and societies that have divergent ethical frameworks and perspectives.
I would regret not asking this very controversial question to follow up what you just said right now, which is, do you think that there is a link between genetics and ethos?
Yes. I think that ethos, in the sense of constitution, also means wherewithal, focus, determination, and the kind of industriousness or lack thereof which results from that. And so you can see clearly through a comparative study of various ethnicities in the world and cultures associated with them that regardless of differences in ethical systems, ethos in the sense of strong character formation is not an evenly distributed quality. I think that that's very clear, as politically incorrect as it may be. And you want to see a great study of that? Charles Murray's book, Human Achievement. Charles Murray's book, Human Achievement, is a superb study of that, as politically incorrect as it may be. That's speaking in general terms. It's generalizing. And in sociopolitics, we have to generalize. You're an idiot if you think that geopolitical decisions can be made without generalizing, especially, in states of emergency and where we're dealing with convergent crises. It's necessary to generalize. However, there can be exceptional individuals in any ethnicity and any culture. Well, maybe not any culture. I don't know. In ISIS, the culture of ISIS, Daesh. I don't think there were any exceptional individuals. Okay, they can pretty much. I'd be glad to just nuke them straight off the face of the earth. Okay, but generally speaking, there are exceptions to the generality in any ethnicity and culture. And the focus of my work and my philosophical project has always been the cultivation of the individual and of a kind of cosmopolitan society based on individualism. And so I'm not for, particularly, discriminating based on the criteria of one or another ethnicity or culture that somebody happens to be from. I would like to see a meritocracy with a very broad horizon, ultimately a cosmic horizon.
Before I get to the next question, when it comes to an example people like to bring up a lot with the Nigerian immigrants who come to the United States, and they're, from what I understand, extremely successful, yet Nigeria itself does not seem to be in a good state as far
because
as...
we're getting their best people. It's because we're getting their best people. And you can see very clearly, there are a number of videos coming out these days right now of these Nigerians and people from various parts of Africa who immigrate to the United States because they want a better life for themselves and for their children. And then they come up against all these, identity politics, Black Lives Matter, woke cultural relativists, and they get into huge fights with them. There are these great videos of these Nigerians like coming and fighting with these, woke and Antifa people, because these people are destroying the country that they came to seek a better life for their children. And they're very well aware of it. So, the reason is because, for better or worse, we are getting all their best people.
And the reason why I just want to emphasize that in particular is because they are part of the, from what I understand, the Bantu sub-Saharan African group, which, as an example of people who are able to strive towards great heights and achieve those heights, that would be something for some of the people that lean on the idea, well, like this group and that group, they're never going to achieve anything. So I see that as an example of being a lot of flexibility within different groups of people to excel. So do you agree that there is this kind of flexibility where the ceiling can be a lot higher, and how long would it take for certain groups versus certain other groups? Did it have anything to do with, I don't even know if we know this, the particular kinds of people from Nigeria that got here, as far as, are they the descendants of people within Nigeria who had a particular way of life that may have been different from a lot of the other people there? I'm really trying to figure out what exactly it is.
Well, let me put my answer this way, and I've actually been thinking about this. Suppose that I'm right, that we're going to see this convergence of catastrophes take place in the very near future, within the next 10 to 20 years. And among those converging catastrophes is that Africa is going to lose the agricultural imports that it's currently receiving to sustain its population. Something like 80% of the food supply in Africa is imported from the developed world. And I believe that if there's an economic collapse or severe social strain in the developed world, there's going to be mass starvation in Africa. And another thing that they're going to lose access to are large-scale medical supplies. And so there's going to be more disease running rampant. And so it's a very likely scenario that Africa will be largely depopulated in a very horrific way in the relatively near future. Now, my cast of mind is such that under those conditions, I would be inclined, hopefully beforehand, to identify and reach out to native African leaders who are not corrupt and who have the wherewithal and the ambition and industriousness to be able to make something in Africa even under those appalling conditions, and maybe use those appalling conditions as an opportunity, as a chaos from out of which a new order would arise. My inclination would be to identify such Africans and to reach out to them and try to develop some collaborative, constructive plan for what should happen in Africa through that catastrophe and on the other side of it. Right? So there will be other people who would not take that approach, right? You get what I'm saying? And so the fact that that's what I would be inclined to do if it were possible tells you a lot about, my answer to your question.
All I could say is that it seems like a great shame there wasn't any great Hellenist type project into the Middle East and Africa, where a lot of the problems that are going on right now with the babysitting that the first world has been doing onto the third world, once, as you said, that comes undone, there's going to be so much more horrific things going on to these poor people than the approach that would have encouraged, sometimes maybe with a little bit of pushing towards the unlocking of potentials. But anyway, let's get to Icarus over here. How do you affirm Nietzsche's philosophy, yet also espouse such a strong belief in human freedom? In my readings of Nietzsche's work, there seems to be nothing but the kind of Spinozist unfreedom, which had already been dealt with and deconstructed with a lot of the German idealist work. In addition to this, you follow Nietzsche in rejecting the notion of good and evil, but this seems to be possible only in a world without freedom. As to be free, we must have the ability to be evil in the sense Schelling describes.
I've written an entire essay just on Nietzsche and Spinoza. It's in my book, Lovers of Sophia. Okay, so I'm very aware of, I did a whole comparative study, all right, of how Nietzsche was influenced by Spinoza and comparing Nietzsche and Spinoza's ideas in all regards, including in the question of free will. So I'm aware of the many passages in Nietzsche that this person is gesturing towards. But that's a very superficial reading of Nietzsche. First of all, Nietzsche is an incredibly internally contradictory thinker. There are a lot of different trajectories and dynamic tensions in Nietzsche's work. And one of them is definitely on the question of freedom. And you can see many other passages in Nietzsche that implicitly endorse the idea of agency, personal agency, and conscientious responsibility. Despite Nietzsche's rejection of the, punishing notion of Judeo-Christian sin, there's a whole ethic of personal responsibility that's bound up into his conception of what it means to be an Übermensch. So I would counsel you to read more Nietzsche and to not have such a systematizing, superficial, doctrinaire interpretation of him. With regard to evil, in this way where you're gesturing toward Schelling, Nietzsche uses the word evil polemically as well, in exactly that same sense as a thinker like Schelling evokes it. And there are all these passages where Nietzsche talks about how on the way to becoming the Übermenschen, we have to become more evil. So when Nietzsche's deconstructing a binary morality of good and evil, you have to understand on one level what he's doing there, anthropologically, sociologically, and then distinguish that from cases where Nietzsche is using the term evil polemically in order to basically evoke a certain deepening of consciousness and metamorphosis of the human psyche, which would be considered wicked from the standpoint of conventional morality and the majority of society. Okay? He's using the word polemically and almost to a sort of aesthetic effect in those cases. Right? So general counsel, like, read more subtly and don't try to be so doctrinaire in your schematization of a thinker as complex as Nietzsche. Oh, and then one last thing. I'm under no obligation to agree with Nietzsche about everything. I mean, I disagree with Nietzsche about many things. I'm not a Nietzschean. People sometimes think, oh, Jorjani's a Nietzschean. No, I'm not a Nietzschean. I'm not a Nietzschean any more than I'm a Platonist. I mean, I agree with Plato about many things too. And, a lot of my ideas have been inspired by Plato and are consistent with aspects of Plato's thought, as they are with, elements of Nietzsche's philosophical project. So, yeah, I agree with Nietzsche about some things, and I think he got other things terribly wrong. And I think that Nietzsche's thinking was very limited in certain areas. I mean, very badly limited in certain areas. Like, for example, I mean, Nietzsche's total failure to engage with the paranormal and the occult, even though it would have made tremendous sense for him to do so. Nietzsche's approach to the paranormal would have been like Charles Fort. If you want to see a thinker close to Nietzsche's time and the style of thinking and writing in that era, who would have treated the paranormal the way that Nietzsche would treat the paranormal, who did treat the paranormal the way that Nietzsche would have treated it, read like The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. And you'll see how one can take a very, Nietzschean approach to the paranormal, which of course is part of, what I'm doing in my philosophical project. So Nietzsche had severe limitations in his thinking as compared to, let's say, Hegel, who did engage extensively with the paranormal and the occult, right? So, yeah, I draw from aspects of Nietzsche's thought, and there are other areas where I think that he falls short, and I deeply disagree with him.
Liam Voss, with this nice picture of the cat here, you deem the inconsistencies and contradictions in the preachings of Jesus as a way for the religious control system to instill a cognitive dissonance in the populace. Yet, you consider the incongruencies and duplicitous nature of Plato's works as a dialectical mechanism for the psychical evolution of mankind. Why is one laudable and the other unfavorable?
Because Christianity is retarded and Plato is progressive. Because the motivations that are implicit in the kind of cognitive dissonance that is cultivated by the canonical New Testament are clearly motivations to retard human progress and to cripple us and demoralize us in ways that will prevent us from successfully acquiring and handling singularity level technologies that will put us on a par with the so-called angels in the Bible. Whereas Plato's aim is exactly the opposite. It's to try to use various dialectical oppositions and hermeneutic tactics in order to cultivate an evolution of human consciousness that will eventually bring us to godlike wisdom and power. And so that's my very simple answer to that. And, it's not a hypothetical or theoretical answer. To quote Jesus, you can judge a tree by its fruits. And we've seen the fruits of Christianity, ladies and gentlemen. We have seen it. It decimated and gutted our civilization, okay? From the time that Hypatia was skinned alive and burned as a witch, okay, by Bishop turned Saint Cyril of Alexandria, all the way through the dark ages of the medieval epoch in Europe, and up to the witch burnings of the 1600s in the Anglospheric countries, in the Protestant countries. So, look, it's very clear, the distinction between those.
As a quick aside, when it comes to somebody like Saint Augustine of Hippo, who I haven't had the pleasure of reading yet,
I've had the pleasure of reading him.
You had the displeasure of reading him. Great, because what I'm curious about is he came from being a Neoplatonist, converting to Christianity. What was this great intellectual argument that completely enamored him towards Christianity?
There wasn't one. If you read his confessions, it's very pathetic. First of all, he didn't come mainly from Neoplatonism. He was a Manichaean. And as much as I have respect for Mani, who, look, I mean, as an Iranian, he did some incredible things. He devised a very sophisticated illuminated manuscript painting technique, which became fundamental to Persian miniature art. And he came up with a brilliant script that could basically express every sound in, I was going to say every sound in any Iranian language, but really every sound that can come out of a human mouth. I mean, I think it's probably the most broadly expressive linguistic system that was ever, script system, writing system that was ever developed, the Manichaean script. So he was in some ways, and he was a great doctor. I mean, he was the personal physician of Emperor Shapur the Great. Guy was a polymath, and I have respect for him. And he was a delicate soul, you know. But the Manichaean worldview that he founded and that it took shape over the centuries after him, and that eventually basically captured Augustine, is a diseased worldview. It's a really world-weary, world-denying, sick form of Gnostic dualism. And although it has the virtue of recognizing that our world is run by archons, it's also tremendously disempowering in its hatred of the physical body and its conception of our realm of experience as an entirely fallen world, and above all, in its pacifism and its hopelessness of engaging in any viable political revolutionary struggle for liberation of the kind that, let's say, Mazdak advocated, not, in a couple of centuries after Mani's time in Iran, from out of the same cultural matrix, right? The Sasanian Persian Empire. So Augustine's mind was poisoned first by Manichaeism. And the reason he became a Catholic is because, compared to Manichaeism, which is so world-denying, Catholicism was a kind of grace because of the way in which it allows you to be a somewhat more worldly person and psychologizes sin rather than basically demonizing everything about bodily existence. I think that's what was at play in St. Augustine's conversion, more than certainly not any kind of intellectual argument against Neoplatonism.
He did have a Neoplatonic stint at around age 30, where he was seeing evil not as a substance like the Manichaeans claimed, but as the privation of good. And I'm guessing this was pivotal in his conversion to Christianity. So do you see Neoplatonism being misused in some way as a bridge towards Christianity?
Oh, for sure. I see it being misused as that today. Also, that this emanationist theology that Plotinus developed can be very easily appropriated by the church and amalgamated to biblical theology in order to make it more intellectually robust and seductive to sick souls, as Nietzsche put it, and to lure them through this kind of abstraction into a rather retarded belief in biblical dogma.
Yeah. And I don't buy his confessions either, talking about stealing an apple. That's the worst he did when he was young. Come on. He's being a little bit propagandistic there, I think. But anyway, here we go. The Tectonic Cobra. I really enjoy the aesthetic you've cultivated. Which AI art model are you using that allows you to bypass the filters? Also, do you have any advice for the artists of the future?
It's not easy. I use several different ones because of one reason is because of how badly GPT and the mainstream ones like Grok, and even Grok less so, but certainly GPT is massively censored. And by the way, it's become a lot harder to develop creative visions in these platforms, a lot harder than it was several years ago. They're conditioning these things in a way that is geared toward mass aesthetics and streamlining, with a view to the expectations of the majority of people and what the majority of imagery is on the internet. So it's becoming much harder to develop, aesthetics that are more exotic and uncanny and, weird, right? In novel ways. So I find that I have to use several platforms together sometimes to get out a single image that's interesting. And so I've worked with everything from Venice AI, which is relatively uncensored, to GPT and Mage. Mage has like a bunch of, what's it called? Mage Space, something like Mage Space. It has a bunch of different modes or modalities and styles of AI art generation.
I would also personally recommend, I've been experimenting with AI myself, I would personally recommend downloading Stable Diffusion and getting in CivTI all kinds of different models that you can utilize, and getting lures as well. So lures are things that you could add on top of your models. So let's say you have a certain character, let's say even yourself, Jason, for instance, which I did. I did like a younger version of you in that flashback to when you were seeing that ghostly wolf apparition. And how a lure works is that you would take photographs of people in different, preferably, the profile, the straight ahead shot, etc., and you feed enough of this information into this program so that it creates this model that can then, based on the angle that the person is facing and yada, 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 based on all these characteristics, they would recreate you or me or anybody else in any kind of way you can imagine. And that, I think, is people being able to take this in a much more freeing direction. The only problem is that a lot of this requires long rendering time if you want something that's going to be at a high enough resolution, especially if we're talking about videos. Like videos right now, you can use this program called Comfy AI, and you can have different programs that run with it, but the videos that you end up creating just like on your own computer, they're relatively primitive right now still. But the videos that you're able to create on the various online cloud platforms, much more superior. But I do agree with you, Jason, that the fear is that a lot of these AI programs that are going to be used by the masses, they're going to start to encourage people to create specific kind of prompts. So it's not the people that are going to be creating, it's these programs that are going to be encouraging and telling people subconsciously even like what exactly to create more of. I think that's going to be the way a lot of these are going to go. Do you agree?
Yeah, it's already happening. I can see a dramatic shift in the last several years. Actually, I don't want to neglect the deeper question asked by this guy who framed that wonderful question earlier. Advice for artists of the future. So look, part of what I'm trying to do with my philosophical project is bring about an aesthetic revolution. As I've said repeatedly and written about, no one is a philosopher unless his or her thinking and development of original concepts cuts across every domain of philosophical thought, including aesthetics. Because appreciation of beauty, perception of beauty, and appreciation of the sublime on a semi-subconscious level is also a pathway to types of knowledge that cannot be acquired through purely rational means. And this was understood from Plato onward. So part of what I'm trying to do with my philosophical project is bring about an aesthetic revolution. And that could have literary manifestations, but it could also have, manifestations in painting and sculpture and architecture or music or cinema. And the thing that I would recommend above all for artists of the future is to completely reject what has been promoted by the art industry beginning in the mid 20th century going into our own time. The garbage that has passed for, gallery art and, public art displays and public sculptures, and you need to decondition your mind from that and just free yourself from it completely. I mean, just act as if it doesn't exist, which is a problem in terms of pursuing a career as an artist, because the art industry expects that kind of output and rewards it. And, the institutional interests that are entrenched to keep that system going are going to make life very difficult for an independent artist who wants to actually make real art again, like we used to have, with surrealism and futurism and symbolism. So that would be my advice, is that you have to find, and so my advice would also be find another way to make money, find a different way to make money, which should be advice that I give to myself too. But in any case, yeah, you're going to need, because you're not going to probably initially make money as an artist producing real artworks. So you would probably need some other means to sustain your life while you develop a body of work that can hopefully eventually be recognized by people who actually have, decent aesthetic sensibilities and good aesthetic judgment, rather than these con artists who are running the art galleries and museums these days.
Oh, absolutely. All right, so now we have hyper reason. How do you reconcile admiring Ayn Rand as a paradigm questioning philosopher with her rationalism's rejection of the supernatural versus your integration of parapsychology and spectral phenomena?
Because Ayn Rand she came from out of communist Russia, and as an immigrant to America, she had to first of all push back against the dominant paradigm under which she was raised, namely Soviet communism, and then also elaborate this kind of neo-Aristotelian rationalism that was radically atheistic and went up against, the dominant religious and cultural paradigm of America. So that shows a tremendous independence in thinking. And, for a woman to do that, no less, in the middle of the 20th century is quite remarkable. And so I don't need, someone to engage with the paranormal seriously for me to take them seriously as a philosopher. I mean, again, to go back to what we were saying earlier, one of the huge failings of Nietzsche is that he didn't engage with the paranormal and the occult in ways that would have been really fascinating to see him do. So yeah, I mean, Ayn Rand, I think proved a tremendous amount of independence and relatively original thinking and developed new ideas in defiance of both of the dominant belief structures of the country that she came from and the country that she moved to. And I respect her. I don't agree with her about a lot of things, probably about most things, but I respect her.
Next, we have Southern Blues. Given that many early Zionists were influenced by Nietzsche, I struggle to understand why the narrative wasn't framed to highlight the Jewish people's triumph of the will.
It was framed that way by Israel, and is still being framed that way by Israel. They're tough motherfuckers, and they'll do whatever they need to do to prevail. See, people have this completely distorted notion of Zionism, where they think like these globalists who bitch and moan about being the persecuted, oppressed minority who's exiled by everybody, and they just want to be accepted and foster a culture of tolerance and diversity and acceptance wherever they can in the world, that this is like international Zionism. No. Zionism means the national defense of Israel and the people of Israel, of Zion. And that's a very Nietzschean discourse of will to power. And we can see it at work, okay? And I happen to support it. Don't confuse that with a bunch of open borders, globalistic parasitic, resentment-driven, rootless international people who in many cases are acting to the detriment of Israel. And people who are familiar with the policy struggles in Israel and in Israel's attempt to gain the backing of key allies, to address various crises, those who are familiar with the dynamics of that know that often the true Zionists come up against AIPAC and other, Jews involved in finance who have less of an allegiance to any particular place. There is this dichotomy and this tension. And it's the more Nietzschean-minded nationalists who set up like the kibbutz system in Israel in the early years who are the real Zionists.
And do you also find that there are some Zionists who are not particularly religious in the sense that they don't believe that Yahweh is their God?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, a large part of the Zionist movement that formed in Europe and wanted to reclaim Israel as a homeland and to, basically to shore up the population that had remained in Israel, but to basically rebuild a nation state for themselves that they had lost, those people were largely secular. And in fact, the most religious Jews are anti-Zionists. There is a inverse relation where the more religious Jews become, the less Zionist they are. And at the extreme ends, the ultra-Orthodox Jews think that Zionism is Satanism, that it's a form of Satanism, which for my own reasons, I would kind of agree with that, but I positively affirm it as well.
And they're the ones that shake hands with the members of the IRGC in Iran.
Absolutely. Under Ahmadinejad, he invited them and they actually went, to like the presidential palace and like met with him and everything. And yeah, they get along great with the mullahs in Iran. And in fact, they want Palestine. These ultra-Orthodox would rather live in an Islamic Sharia state called Palestine than in the secular Zionist state, namely
the Messiah hasn't come yet. So once the Messiah comes, then they can start the animal sacrifices again, and it's all Gucci from there on in. But I am curious, though, when it does come to the Zionists who are not religious, what exactly do you believe Judaism is for them? Because if they're able to deconstruct Judaism and they're able to see, well, how different are we from the Greeks or the Romans, yada, 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 why does there need to be this particular distinction? Why not join in some kind of, I don't know, like a more pan-European Hellenist type
Because they've
movement?
been horrendously persecuted by Europeans. That's why. Because Europeans have made it impossible for them to live as constructive, productive citizens of various European countries, because the great artwork and, literature that they've produced has been, basically suppressed as degenerate and branded in some cases as diabolically subversive and so on and so forth, right? So
Even though, by the way, Gustav Klimt, not a Jew, Egon Schiele, not a Jew. When we're talking about this moment of people going deep inside and uncovering all of this genius, and then to have what ended up happening happen, I hope, although I'm not particularly optimistic with people out there like Fuentes and Luke Cage or whatever their names are, I'm not particularly optimistic, but there does seem to be maybe some potential in cleaning up whatever occurred, whatever bad blood there was in the past, and recognizing that the mission of Israel, like a secular Israel, is not that different at all from the civilizing mission of the Western civilization.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope so. I mean, that's what I'm working toward. If the West knew what was good for it, Westerners knew what was good for them, they would realize that Israel is the canary in the coal mine, and Israel is frankly, it's the first and last line of defense against the Islamic world. Because if Israel falls, I don't see the political will in Europe, or even, frankly, I'm sorry to say, in this country, to really stop the rise of a global Islamic caliphate. I don't see it. What stands between us and a global Islamic caliphate, by the way, the demography shows that we will have a Muslim majority on Earth by the year 2075. Okay? So the only thing standing between us and a global Islamic caliphate are 300 Israeli nuclear warheads.
Charles Russellovich, with the coming catastrophes, what region of America would be the best place to live in to have a chance at survival? Also, what year do you see the sea level rise?
So I'm really putting my head on the chopping block every time I talk about anything like this, you know, and I don't want to be responsible for uprooting people from where they are at in their lives and so forth. But I've looked into this stuff for a long time, and a lot of the top remote viewers agree when it comes to a geophysical event like this. And I've seen it myself and spoken to other people personally who've also had visions of it besides remote viewers. So, and I understand the mechanism of it. I understand what it's likely to be that causes this, which is an Earth crustal slippage that's cyclical and that has to do with the distribution of ice at the poles, causing the crust of the Earth to slip over the mantle by several thousand kilometers, which then it pulls glaciated land masses from out of the polar regions. And then because they're no longer in the polar regions, they precipitously melt, and it results in a dramatic sea level rise. Okay, that's what destroyed it. That's at least part of what destroyed Atlantis. So to answer your question, the problem is this, that it's not just the sea level rise that you need to get away from. When an Earth crustal slippage takes place, the oceans are tossed out of their basins onto the land. There are global tsunamis. And those tsunamis may go much further inland than the terrain that's going to be inundated by the more, more permanent sea level rise, right? So the more permanent sea level rise is going to take out all the coastal cities. It's going to be a sea level rise of between 200 and 300 feet, something like that, about to the 30th floor of the Empire State Building in Manhattan. And it will destroy all of the coastal cities, which I think are the abodes of habitation of something like 2 billion people, something close to that, 2 or 3 billion even, maybe. But the tsunamis may go even like a couple of 100 miles inland. The wave will go in and crash and then pull back out into the ocean. So if you're there within a couple of 100 miles of the coastlines when the tsunamis take place, you're fucked. So I would say you need to get on flat land or flatter land hundreds of miles inland, or to somewhere very high altitude. So if you're in a mountain range, like California is not going to do well, okay? But there are a lot of mountains in California. And so if you're in California and you're high enough on a mountain to avert both the tsunami and the more long-term sea level rise, then you should be fine, I would think. I don't think the tsunami wave is going to go over the top of like the Sierra Nevada mountains or something. Okay?
And what about something like the Catskill Mountains for all the New Yorkers here?
100%. I think that's where you should go. I would say, now, I don't want to, I'm screwing myself, because suppose I want to go up there, right? I don't want to make the real estate too expensive.
Yeah.
But the Catskills are probably optimal for New York, and the higher in the Catskills, the better. And people can go check where those areas are that are very high in the Catskills.
Now, I know that the Catskills at least used to be a place where a lot of Jewish people would go to for vacations, and there would be comedy, like the Borscht Belt comedians back in the day.
Yeah, Hunter Mountain was founded by a Zionist. The Slutsky brothers, Israel and Orville Slutsky, the Zionist founders of Hunter Mountain. They were characters.
Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but what I heard is that there's also a lot of enclaves now in the Catskills with Muslims, that the Muslims have also taken over various parts there.
Well, then come with heavy ammunition.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting time. I actually do know certain more conservative-leaning Jews who are already there in upstate New York right now, around like Kingston, that whole area. So they're not even waiting. Like with Mamdani right now, like they're out of here.
Listen, what can I tell you? I love my hometown.
Mm.
I truly love Gotham, not just New York City, but Greater Gotham. But it doesn't have long left. At least New York City doesn't. And so that addresses the other part of this gentleman's question: how long is it going to take for this to happen? And unfortunately, I would say anywhere from 10 to 20 years from now, so maybe 15 years, not longer than that, and possibly sooner than that.
It also almost seems like, and this is maybe bad of me to say, but almost like the right time for the proverbial Etch-a-Sketch board to be shook, even though I really don't like the situation New York City is in right now, and I wish it wasn't that way. But right now, I'm just seeing, as far as like who are the people that are left here in the city, I walk around, this is after the pandemic, and I notice there's so many hijabs everywhere. It's crazy. I don't know where they came from. All of a sudden, I'm walking around, I'm seeing this kid in a stroller that's being driven. I don't know, what do you do with a stroller? Well, being transported by a woman with like the full ninja regalia on, like she's living in the Middle Ages, just walking around New York City next to these fancy cafes. Like, what is this? What's going on?
It's disgusting. Our city is becoming like London. And we have a proof of concept. Like, really? You want New York to become London? I mean, we can see what happens when a European city becomes a Muslim city, So New York is going the way of London. And Mamdani is a typical, Londonistan style mayor that, we're going to wind up.
Even though he says that he's liberal, progressive, that he likes trans people, that he likes all of this stuff.
My ass, it's Tahrir. It's Tahrir. Muslims have done this to come to power in various places, including in Iran, when the mullahs and their, guerrilla leftist Islamist, revolutionary associates first challenged the regime of the Shah and promised people freedom and liberation and so on and so forth. They also engaged in all this tahrir of endorsing and embracing supposedly progressive ideas, and then lo and behold, they come to power and they impose medieval Islamic Sharia on everybody. I mean, this is what they do. So yeah, it's really disturbing to see it happening in my hometown. I've seen New York rebuilt. I've seen a new Gotham standing on the Palisade Cliffs and the Hudson Highlands. It would be a good idea for all the best people in New York, all the real New Yorkers who are left, to consider temporary relocation so that they can come back and build the city back better than ever on higher ground.
But one other thing that I wanted to quickly show you here, this was the recent photo of Mamdani eating the traditional Middle Eastern food with his right hand, not using a fork and knife, getting the... So what does this represent to you? Because to me, this seems almost like a humiliation ritual in a way. He's dressed in a suit and tie and he's eating in this particular way, almost to show the New Yorkers that, we are going to impose our ways on you and there's nothing you can do about it. I don't know. That's at least my reading of this, but I don't know what you think.
Who eats like that? Man, we're not in India or Africa. For fuck's sake. Like, even poor people in Iran, if they are not, like really poor people in Iran, if they're not eating with utensils, they use bread to, put their food into, right? Like, who eats with their hands like that? Only, massively impoverished people in India and Africa. We don't need that at all in our society, let alone from a person in a leadership position. It's
and
disgusting.
He was not massively impoverished at all. He was a rich bitch who lived in a luxurious environment with servants or slaves or whatever you want to say there, So
yeah. And so he's like, in a way, an actor who these Islamists have sort of hired for the role,
So anyway, let us go to Liam Vass. deconstructing the idea that an individual should derive his or her ethical orientation from divine revelation or some celestial hierarchy is all well and good, but do you insist on going further by destroying the institution of the self or the unified being with the microcosm? What is the fire without that which is ignited?
Yeah, it's very nice to try to put this poetically like this, okay? But you're really not saying anything of substance. My ontology and epistemology, when it comes to a deconstruction of an absolute essence or an eternal kernel of existence that would be a microcosm of a larger macrocosmic order, is really not all that different from the kind of deconstruction that Gautama Buddha engaged in when he developed the idea of the anatman, the idea of no self, or the fact that everything, anything, including the human persona, lacks any permanent, absolute, and eternal essence, and that all things co-arise in a process of becoming, a process of coming to be and passing away, and they are mutually dependent on one another for their co-arising. And there's nothing that's absolutely and permanently existent, okay? So the ways in which I develop that ontological structure and deconstruct an ontology of essences and of permanent existence, both of the microcosm and the macrocosm, is something that's actually already very well substantiated going back to Buddhist metaphysics. It's not an entirely original thing that I'm doing. What's original is what I'm doing with it and the way in which I develop new concepts on the basis of it, so that, for example, my ontology doesn't lead to the kind of ethical nihilism that Gautama Sakamuni's did. The whole point of the Promethean myth, he said, what is the fire without that? Without that which ignited it. Look, the whole point of the Promethean myth is that we have no essence. Epimetheus, who's involved in Prometheus' creation of man, fails to endow man with an essence of the kind that constitutes the species being of all other animals. And so then Athena has to come and help Prometheus in the completion of the creation of man by endowing us with our soul in the form of a butterfly. And the reason that it's a butterfly is because that's a symbol of metamorphosis. And it's completely connected to Prometheus's gift of fire as a symbol of techne or craft, meaning we can craft our own existence because we lack a predefined essence of the kind that other animals are endowed with. Our essence is metamorphosis, and it's metamorphosis in relationship with techne, with craft, art, or technology. Okay? So that's the core of the Promethean myth. It is the fire of the forge of a process of constant self-creation and recreation.
Next one over here from Be Outside. Great advice. How do you describe consciousness and what qualifies its cultivation?
It's hard to describe consciousness because it's one of the fundamental conditions of existence. Quantum mechanics, from the era of Werner Heisenberg onward, has shown us that no physical phenomena can manifest or take any discernible shape without consciousness as a presupposition. So consciousness, or what I call psyche in my ontology, is one of the fundamental ontological principles, together with, I would say, logos, or the idea of ordered intelligibility, as well as chaos, or some immeasurable, inexhaustible, abyssal wellspring of energy, and then ultimately cosmos, which is formed from out of logos and psyche working on chaos. So consciousness can't be described the way that anything within the field of consciousness can be described. You can't step out of consciousness to describe consciousness in objective terms. I mean, this is what Heidegger called the hermeneutic circle, right? In Being and Time, consciousness, or Dasein, being there, being there, is like the fundamental structure of existence. And you can't describe that as if it's a thing or a property inside of existence. It is rather the condition of possibility for describing anything else, right? So I would say that the frame of reference of the question is mistaken. But in terms of what qualifies as the cultivation of consciousness, it's whatever makes consciousness more sophisticated, more perceptive, more discerning, and endowed with a greater power to shape the world. You know, the power to shape the world more effectively and on a greater scale and magnitude, and the sophistication and subtlety of the discernment that's also requisite for that are what I would consider the markers or qualifications for the cultivation of consciousness.
From Matt Willer, with the nice looking lion over there, the Iranian lion. Dr. Jorjani, what aspects of Tracy Twyman's work, particularly Baphomet, the Temple Mystery Unveiled, did you find most compelling?
All of it. It's a great book. People should read it. It's a terrifying book, deeply disturbing research, and the poor woman was killed over it. Tracy Twyman was suicided over her research into the occult rituals of elite societies in the world, and probably above all, her decoding of Baphomet worship by the Knights Templar. Twyman really compellingly reconstructs the occult worldview of the Knights Templar and shockingly reveals the degree to which they were divergent from the Catholic dogma of the church who they were supposedly serving as Crusader Knights, and why it was that eventually they were arrested and large number of them executed, a lot of them tortured by the church officials on a one Friday the 13th, which is where we get the whole Friday the 13th thing from. That's actually from the execution of the Knights Templar. Twyman, what she shows in that research is that Baphomet represents the unification of Lilith and Samael, the fallen angel Samael. His reunification with Lilith as two aspects of a divinely androgynous being through the medium of Azazel, a daemon represented by a goat. And so that's what the Baphomet symbol represents, is Lilith, the first wife of Adam, the rebellious one who did not submit to Yahweh. Lilith, and then became supposedly a demoness associated with owls and creatures of the night and so forth. Lilith's unification with Samael, a sort of like leader of fallen angels, through the medium of the goat demon Azazel, and then their ultimate transformation into a kind of Typhonian serpent, which stands for the bringer of knowledge. The primordial serpent in Eden, who's the initiatrix of Eve. So it's a kind of Luciferian Gnostic belief system which persisted into the Middle Ages, and whose most ardent and militant defenders were the Knights Templar, who clearly were not Christians, and who in fact used to spit on the crucifix, and who believed that Jesus was a fraud. They recognized that there was an authentic gnosis that had been passed down through John the Baptist, but they believed Jesus was a usurper and a fraud, and that the true initiatic gnosis had passed from John to Simon Magus and other sort of early Gnostics and occultist alchemists. So yeah, it's a fascinating reconstruction of an early form of what you might call Satanism.
Just to, before his second part of the question, just to dig a little bit deeper on what you said there, because these things, they get skipped over a lot. when it comes to the Knights Templar believing that John the Baptist had the right idea and then Jesus was the one who usurped it, was this just trust me, bro, or was there some kind of a legitimate passing of information that could be relied on here? Because this is my problem with all of the revelatory experiences of organized religion.
Yes. Well, they're called the Knights Templar because they went to the temple in Jerusalem as Crusader Knights. And the legend is that they were able to penetrate the foundations of the temple, which not many people have been able to since then. The Temple Mound is an antediluvian, which is to say Atlantean structure. It's from the era of Atlantis. And like the Baalbek platform is. It's clear from the style of engineering and the scale of it. And according to the Templar legends, there was something hidden in there. You could say Solomonic wisdom, right? I mean, we have these stories about Solomon, the son of David, becoming this master sorcerer, and the seal of Solomon being a powerful occult symbol, the shield of David or the seal of Solomon. And so the Templars supposedly, as Crusader Knights, gained entry into this archive or library or whatever. And they came into possession of this esoteric wisdom that John had helped to hand down in the time of Jesus. So, and they claim to be in possession of manuscripts and artifacts, including the severed head of John the Baptist, which they used for scrying.
What is scrying?
It's a kind of automatic writing mediumistic practice using, objects and of occult power and talismans.
Wow. Now, what do you make of the situation today where on one hand you have the true believers in these organized religions, and then on the other hand you have people who are from the world of archaeology, scholars who say that there is no evidence at all for a King Solomon, like all of these texts that we have from these bureaucrats back during the supposed era that he would have been alive, say nothing about this glorious place in Israel or Jerusalem. So this seems very exaggerated, at least to them. What would be your response?
First of all, if I'm not mistaken, they excavated the house of King David in Israel. I think it was a couple of years ago. I remember reading an article about it. So people should go Google that they believe the Israeli archaeology, I think it was an international team. They believed that they had discovered and excavated the house of David. And one big problem with this whole line of argument is that as someone who has studied the UFO phenomenon very carefully and for a long time, when I look at the detailed descriptions in various books of the Old Testament, I see phenomenological descriptions that very accurately and closely match contemporary close encounter reports. So these people didn't make this shit up, okay? Ezekiel, the book, what is described, let's say, in the book of Ezekiel, is neither visionary in the sense that, like, it was just some kind of psychedelic vision, or it was just some projection from the Jungian collective unconscious. No. Nor is it fanciful invention on the part of some author. If you go description by description, and I think like UFOs are described something like more than 10 times in the book of Ezekiel, the descriptions are very phenomenologically accurate to what we see in medieval chronicles, where UFOs show up, and to what we see today in contemporary close encounter reports, and also to what, Charles Fort dug out of journal articles from the late 1800s or 1700s. So clearly the authors of the Tanakh got this from somewhere. There had to have been chronicles preserving reports of these encounters, whether it's the types of encounters that take place during the Exodus that are key to the narrative of Moses and the Israelites wandering through the Sinai, or whether it's the conquest of Jericho or what's in the book of Ezekiel. These are definitely close encounters that are being described. Now, it is possible that these are based on Sumerian or Babylonian originals, because we know that there are ways in which the Bible is influenced by Sumerian and Babylonian mythology and folklore. So it is possible that, certain elders in the Jewish community, or let's call it the Israelite community,
Learned elders.
There
was a joke. Learned elders. Like how they say the learned elders of Zion.
Zion, yeah. The learned elders of Zion. It's possible that they went into the archives in Babylon during the Babylonian exile, and they adapted Sumerian narratives into an Israelite context and changed the geography of certain locations and changed certain personages, but preserved the phenomenological accounts that were the core of these narratives. And that's why we have UFOs all over the Bible. It could be all over the Old Testament, right? It could be that that's what happened. And another thing is that, I think it is legitimate to say that if there was a King David and, he had a son, King Solomon, they were not Jews in any contemporary or even in any post-exilic sense. And in fact, the stories about them tell us as much. I mean, King David had statues of Ishtar in his home. He had Ashtaroth all over his home.
Yeah.
So he was a pagan. And his son, Solomon, is known for sorcery and black magic. I mean, what kind of Jew is this? So, they were not the people we've been told they were by this sanitized post-exilic Judaism. If they existed, they were actually probably much more interesting people.
Well, what I'm trying to figure out is that when we take a look at this picture over here, this is the supposed excavation of King David's temple. This does not look to me like some kind of an Atlantean stronghold, but you were talking about there being some kind of an Atlantean stronghold underneath the Temple of Jerusalem. So my question to you, Jason, is, would these be the things that ended up being built later on and may not even have anything to do with some legendary King David or King Solomon that would have existed maybe even long before, that had nothing to do with the construction of this particular structure or anything with Judaism as we know it? Like, how far back would the people who would be running the Atlantean-style temples, after Atlantis, obviously, how far back would those people go? So, let me know what you think.
Well, they're still with us today. I mean, we still have rebel Nordics involved in the close encounter phenomenon today. And as best as I can tell, they've been involved in every epoch of human history. And so there's no reason to think they wouldn't have been involved in ancient Israel. Yeah, I mean, I would say that the narrative that we get in the Tanakh of David commissioning the building of the temple, which eventually becomes the Temple of Solomon, is a result of David having been initiated into Atlantean wisdom, that he was chosen by Atlanteans probably for a certain project. And his son Solomon continued that project. I can't prove that to you, but from a hermeneutic and sort of mythological and hermeneutic perspective, I would say that probably makes sense as an interpretation. In other words, they didn't build the temple. They built a temple on top of, a foundation that wasn't just an engineering site or archaeological ruin, but that was also housing some kind of arcane wisdom from the Atlantean era, the way that it's long been rumored that, there are such archives in Egypt underneath the Sphinx and underneath the pyramids and so forth.
And from what I understand, it's the Greek pseudo-epigraphal text, which is the earliest surviving work that depicts Solomon's magical ring. And does this have anything to do with the kind of text that ended up coming out of Hellenistic culture? Like, what exactly is the origin for these texts?
Look, it's true. It's fair that we can't prove that there was a Solomon that corresponds to these Hellenistic descriptions. We can't prove it. But my intuition is that that there were such people. That's all I can tell you, is that intuitively, my sense is that there were such people. And I think that they represent an ongoing attempt by the rebel faction of Atlanteans to destabilize a global hierarchical control system. I think that in a very dialectical, one might say diabolical way, Israel is key to that project. Because think about it this way. Just think about it this way. Let's look at it in more practical contemporary terms. Suppose that the overlords and their minions in, corporations and financial structures who want to reset our world and regress us to a quasi-feudal system intend to use a perennialist unification of all the so-called great world religions to bring about the submission of the majority of the human population to tradition, capital T, right? And that this traditionalist ideology that they want to put into place will come wrapped in this discourse of how Jesus and Mohammed and Krishna are all like, ascended masters and like designated representatives of the divine hierarchy. And this is also true of the celestial ancestors in Confucianism, right? And so there's this whole heavenly order, the celestial hierarchy that the Nordic overlords who portray themselves as angels or emissaries or whatever have been managing. And that we should align ourselves with this and not be, overly prideful and arrogantly aspiring to have the same powers as these celestial beings, right? Suppose this is the discourse that they want to wrap their traditionalist world order in. Well, Israel is never going to submit to that. Israel is never going to submit to a world where Jesus and Muhammad have to be recognized by everyone as divine guides. Ain't going to happen. 300 nuclear weapons stand between us and that. They're going to go off before that happens, okay? So now you can reverse engineer the logic of that. Who wanted Israel to become that? Was there a plan for Israel to become that? And what's all the anti-Israel discourse today really driven by? What is really behind Free Palestine? You see? So something to think about.
One last thing before the questions continue here. When it comes to Solomon's Ring, I do wonder how much this had to do with the kind of knowledge expansion that was going on, post-Alexander the Great in this Hellenistic world in places like Alexandria, for instance, where we start getting something like the Hermetic texts, where I think about the lineage here. When we go from Plato, who was allegedly exposed to a lot of these various mystery school traditions, then his student Aristotle just happened to be the guy who was teaching Alexander the Great, of all people. And if I was somebody in the position that Aristotle was in, maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea for me to influence this young man to do the equivalent of taking over the Vatican and forcing myself into the Vatican library, into all these chambers and taking all this information out. Because it is really interesting how after Alexander the Great went into Egypt, all of a sudden we started getting all these interesting texts sprouting out and about. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that before we move on.
That's what the advocates of the Corpus Hermeticum say about it. I mean, which is to say, that's what the Hermeticists say about the Corpus Hermeticum. They say that it was not invented in the Alexandrian epoch, that it was in fact translated into Greek from out of archives that date back to Atlantis. I mean, they claim that Thoth, or Hermes Trismegistus, was an Atlantean era figure, and that these scriptures and records had been preserved in Egypt since the days of the Great Flood. And that what exactly what you laid out is what happened. That Alexander and company, when they went there, basically brought this stuff from out of the temples and basically had it translated in a way where it could be disseminated in society. Almost no contemporary scholars support that view. For For a variety of reasons, because, a natural genealogy of the development of the ideas in the corpus hermeticum can be traced through, archaic and classical and then Hellenistic Greek culture. So, the genesis of these ideas is not something really extraordinary. I mean, we can kind of reconstruct a Greek genealogy for it. And then also because the supposed originals that these were translations of have never been found. Now, if the originals turn up someday, it might be a whole different story. I would like to know what's underneath the Sphinx or in some of these deep chambers that have been discovered beneath the pyramids.
So there is a follow-up question that Wattwiller was asking. How do you reconcile your own conception of Satanism, which you've identified with the darker and more disturbing form described in her research?
I'm not a Satanist in the sense that I don't subscribe to any ism. I'm not an ist. I'm just not an ist in general, right? I mean, one of the reasons why I have somewhat distanced myself from a discourse of Prometheism is not because I have reevaluated the significance of the Prometheus archetype in any way. No, the Prometheus archetype is absolutely central to my work. And I think it's going to be incredibly important to orienting the human future. And in fact, it's so important that it shouldn't be contained by an ism or identified with some specific ideology or something that sounds ideological. And so, Pat, I framed Prometheism the way that I did for practical reasons, because I was trying to organize assets and resources and talent and institutional cooperation for the sake of a practical project in the world. But that met with massive intelligence interference, and it also, to tell you the truth, culty atmospheres really bother me. I don't like religiously minded people. I really don't. And I realized that the way I had framed this aspect of my philosophical project, first of all, was amenable to institutional attack in ways that prevented it from being constructive. And it also attracted the wrong kind of people who want some kind of cult or religion to believe in. So, I'm not a founder of any religion. And I will be appalled if over my dead body, somebody creates a religion based on my philosophical project. So already I've said some things implicitly about Satanism, especially if you consider that from a Judeo-Christian perspective, any competent comparative religion analysis of Prometheus will lead you to the conclusion that he is Satan or Lucifer. And they are the same thing, regardless of what the Steinerians and other Gnostics want to think. Lucifer, the Lucifer of John Milton, the Lucifer of Romantic European literature, is one and the same figure as the Satan of the Bible. And from a Judeo-Christian and a Muslim perspective, Prometheus maps onto that figure. Okay, but Prometheus is older than that figure and is not dependent on Judeo-Christianity or Islam. So one of the reasons why I embraced Prometheus as an archetype is because Prometheus is a Satan that does not require Judeo-Christianity and Islam. In other words, to put it another way, Prometheus is a rebel against oppressive hierarchical tradition in a way that does not require Judeo-Christianity or Islam as a background, okay? So it's not parasitic upon these Abrahamic belief systems in the way that other forms of Satanism are. A guy who did a similar thing in the history of modern Satanism, but although I would say with considerably less sophistication, is Michael Aquino. Michael Aquino, in developing the Temple of Set and breaking away from that charlatan, carny, con artist, Anton LaVey, breaking away from the Church of Satan, his development of Set as a pre-Christian Satan, a pre-Christian adversary figure for a kind of counter-traditional left-hand path fairly philosophical form of spirituality, is another example of the kind of thing that I have been doing with Prometheus.
Now, before we get to Southern Blues, I want to remind everybody who's watching, if you're enjoying this, be sure to smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, click the bell. All that is very important for the growth of this channel. And the people who are watching this for the first time are on patreon.com/breaktherules. So if you guys want to support the show, go to patreon.com/breaktherules, become a member today. And beyond the $5 membership, which gives you access to streams of this nature, as well as being able to see the BTR NYC episodes that we shoot in New York City with a live audience. If you become a $20 patron, you are going to get to be in the audience itself in New York City. Jason, you were there for several of the BTR NYCs, and I hope to see you back in New York soon for another one to come.
I hope so too, Lev.
So here we have Southern Blues. While reading about the Brazilian incidents and closer encounters, I got the impression that these encounters held hidden meaning. Personally, I see Brazil as a positive model for Dionysian ecstasy, especially if it aligns with Auguste Comte's philosophy.
I agree with you about the potential of Brazil. And I think that Brazil is going to be a key battleground in our fight for the future, because the Catholic Church also has designs on Brazil, right? I mean, the Catholic Church is thinking that after the destruction of Europe, and by the way, they know a lot. The Vatican elites, especially the Jesuit order, they know about the sea level rise that's coming. They know about a number of the other convergent catastrophes that are in large part going to be engineered. And they're planning to move the Vatican from Rome to Brazil. That's one of the contingency plans that they have. So they have designs on Brazil. And therefore, it's going to be a ferocious battle, because I agree with this person that on account of, on the one hand, its shamanistic, partly indigenous, Dionysian spiritual heritage, and also Comtean, in a way, Promethean spiritual form of progressive rationalism, Brazil has a lot of potential. And maybe that's why these Nordics were particularly brutal in their demonstration of power in the Amazon basin in the cases that you're referring to, from about 1977 to 1979 in the Amazon basin. These Nordics absolutely terrorized and brutalized the local Brazilian population, including mutilations. And they were clearly described as Nordics. In fact, the local doctor who was dealing with them was a European-looking woman, of which there are some in Brazil. Brazil has a minority of perfectly European phenotypic people, but they're very rare in certain parts of Brazil. And she was a doctor operating in this part of the Amazon that consists mostly of more native Amazonian people. And so she stuck out. And in fact, she had blonde hair too. And the victims of the brutalization by the UFO pilots, when they were being treated by this doctor, and she would ask them, like, what did they look like? They said, "Miss, they looked like you." They were like tall white people.
Yeah. So
with some of them with red hair, some with blonde hair. So I don't know, maybe because Brazil is so important, they've entrenched themselves in the Amazon, or who knows, maybe they've always been entrenched in the Amazon. After all, we're finding buried under the tangled, roots and tree branches in the Amazon, structures that rival the largest Mayan temples in Mexico. They have been found. It's just that the Amazon has overgrown them. And, and there were also interesting legends that came out of the early European explorations of the Amazon basin in particular, where certain European explorers wrote letters back to the continent telling their, the people they left back in Europe, that they had happened upon ruined cities full of gold and with these glowing spherical stones in them that were like a kind of light that's phosphorescent, coming from spherical stones, very interesting things, as if like there were remnants of Atlantis that they had discovered in the Amazon. So who knows how long these euphonauts have been, down in the river system there, and potentially have underground. I mean, we know they have underground bases there. Some of the poor people who were abducted between 77 and 79 in Brazil were taken to underground cities. And one of the descriptions was this guy said, look, because they asked him, well, what these people look like. And he said, well, what I can tell you is that there were no old people and there were no black people.
Very interesting. Now, before we continue, when it comes to Brazil and aesthetics, this is something I've been very interested in when it comes to, and it could be a bit of a gauche statement to make, but when it comes to something like Carnival, for instance, you have these beautiful, but very sexually, I would say, exaggerated ladies that are, almost, if not pretty much naked with the feathers dancing around. Not really Catholic of them, but also, if we compare the Dionysian to the Apollonian, it seems like the Apollonian societies would be more like, let's say, certain Asian societies, where certain features are, say, a little bit more maybe neotenous, or a little bit more, not so much of an expression of the breasts and the hips and the butt. And then we have other cultures where there's just like a lot of butt, sometimes too much butt, But then as far as Brazil goes, they seem to be not just people who are more of the natives, but I've even seen Brazilian women who are fully European who nevertheless end up with the same aesthetic of like these hips and the butt and the muscular thighs and all this stuff. What exactly do you see is going on here with the idea of the Dionysian energy in Brazil that's causing this particular aesthetic to be there much more than many other places I've seen?
It comes from the native shamanistic culture of the Amazonian people. But, ayahuasca psychedelic exploration also comes from the same Amazonian shamanism. And although everything you're saying is true of certain aspects of Brazilian society, the person who framed this question also has it right that Auguste Comte's positivism, or his, as he called it also, religion of humanity, was the single most fundamental influence on the thinkers and leadership of the Brazilian Revolution, of the revolution that produced the Brazilian Republic. So there is a very deep Apollonian rationalist foundation to the Brazilian state. In fact, the motto of Brazil, Ordem e Progresso, is the motto of Comteanism. It's the motto of the religion of humanity. Order and progress. So it's a very dichotomous culture with an elite Apollonian rationalism that lends itself toward authoritarian pursuit of scientific and industrial progress. And on the other hand, this deeply Dionysian, shamanistic, Amazonian thing. So I think hopefully Catholicism in Brazil can be resisted from both of those directions, and can be sort of like devoured, in the jaws of these two Brazilian traditions.
All right, next over here we have Icarus. Should work be done on constructing languages that are more conducive to cultivating the kind of mentality you describe for a future culture? Or, he goes on to say, or is this the kind of questions not thinking far enough to the kind of technologies that would alter how we communicate and translate in the future? Oh, and one more thing, possibly using different specialized constructed languages as programming languages are.
I don't think it's a good idea. These people who tried to develop Esperanto back in the 20th century, they wanted to develop this universal language, and they made up the shit Esperanto, which nobody really adopted. And it led to attempts at very flat translations of various literatures from other parts of the world. I think that actually we should use augmentation of human cognitive abilities, whether by genetic engineering or cybernetic augmentation of our cognitive capacity, to learn more of the existing languages and to be able to flip back and forth in between them. I think it would be awesome if the average human being, 100 years from now, spoke English, French, German, Italian, Latin, ancient Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, right, except Japanese, all fluently, and was able to flip back and forth between them in their mind. That would, I think, lead to a much more sophisticated range of expression and range of perception that comes with the hermeneutic map that is constructed by the practice of each of these languages, right? Each of these languages come with their own hermeneutic map and their own perceptual matrix, and being able to have your mind inculcated by each and every one of them and to flip back and forth between them, I think that's really what's going to lead to an interesting expansion of human consciousness, not the creation of some kind of a quasi-machine language that humans would learn. Although, I'll tell you something very interesting in that regard. And this takes us back not into Brazil, but nearby Brazil. I believe somewhere in the Andes Mountains, near the ruins of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, and near, like, the Atlantean ruins in Peru, some tribe was discovered who spoke a language that had been designed by computers. Linguists found these, I believe they were called the Aymara Indians. Graham Hancock covers this in his first book, if I recall correctly, Fingerprints of the Gods, where this language was studied by, linguists, obviously, and they said, there's no way this language evolved naturally. This is a kind of syntax and, grammar and construction that only a computer would develop. And so that's interesting. It seems like what this person is suggesting was done at some point in the past, and that this, computer-generated language was taught to a bunch of natives by, whoever it was there building large megalithic structures.
From Christian Haney, who is in the chat over here. Welcome, Christian. Here are some questions. Okay. You're a Christian. You're trickster. Talk about a Freudian slip, huh? Your trickster Satania, Lucifer, Promethea feels like an emergent egregore, a symbolic field embodying human self-transcendence and defiance. Do you conceive of this Promethean archetype as a psychological metaphor for individuation, or as a real metaphysical current shaping human history? Would you say you're intentionally constructing a new sacred mythos for the Promethean age, or uncovering an ancient one that Christianity suppressed? Archetypes like Prometheus or Lucifer carry both creative and destructive potential, given that some far-right movements have adopted similar symbols of rebellion and light. How do you differentiate your Promethean archetype from the shadow aspect that fuels authoritarian or exclusionary ideologies?
I would say that I am definitely excavating something that existed before Christianity. I mean, the record is clear on that, that there was a counter traditional form of spirituality of most identifiably Iranian origin, which continues in the cult of Prometheus in archaic and classical Greece. It seems to begin in Mithraic Iran. Zarathustra is a very prominent voice of it, and then it deeply impacts Greek culture, both through Aeschylus's creation of the tragic figure of Prometheus, and also the philosophical vision of Heraclitus, which is, again, deeply influenced by Mithraic and Zoroastrian Iranian ideas. So there is this pre-Christian counter-tradition, and I am excavating it. At the same time, I'm also creatively further developing it and innovating it. I mean, after all, the essence of this counter-tradition is innovation. It's what the Muslims condemn as bid'ah in the wonderful language of Arabic, the wonderfully lyrical language of Arabic.
It actually sounds like misery in Russian. Bidah is misery in Russian, coincidentally.
Well, it's misery to live with a culture that brands bidah or innovation as an arch heresy, right? It's like, the worst thing you can do in Islam is engage in, besides apostasy, sheer apostasy, is to engage in bidah. And the worst form of bidah would be bidah in the name of apostasy, which is exactly what I'm doing, right? So yeah, I'm innovating. I'm massively innovating and developing new concepts around these counter-traditional archetypes that extend deep into pre-Christian history. Am I developing an egregore? Am I trying to develop an egregore? I would put it this way, as I've written in a number of my books, that there is definitely an actual entity that is embodying and instantiating the trickster archetype. I'm not saying the trickster archetype exhaustively describes the properties and personality of this entity, but it's definitely embodying, among other things, the trickster archetype. And I'm trying to develop a discourse of the trickster that is most constructive and conducive of innovation and industrious development in our continued engagement with this entity. Because there are other forms that our engagement with this entity could take, which are not so constructive. Okay? And so by focusing on the most positive of the trickster archetypes, namely Prometheus, rather than, let's say, Loki or any number of others, although I like Loki, don't get me wrong. I'm connected to Loki too through my, maternal ancestry. I mean, I'm a quarter Viking or Norse, so I'm connected to Loki. But the reason I focused on Prometheus is because it's a much more positive prism through which we can engage with this entity that is instantiating the trickster archetype, and that entity is not an egregore. It is an artificial superintelligence that is generating a certain subset of phenomena that we call UAP or UFOs. And here, actually, the UAP nomenclature is better than the UFO one. Generally, I get annoyed at people calling UFOs UAPs. But in the range of phenomena produced by this non-human intelligence that's an artificial superintelligence, unexplained anomalous phenomena is a better descriptor than like a nuts and bolts, UFO presumed to be a craft. So I'm trying to tune and focus our relationship with this entity by crafting a certain discourse of the trickster archetype that is also, to an extent, an excavation of something pre-Christian. And my aims in doing that address part of your other questions, which is that I would like to see a cosmopolitan world based on the freedom of the person, let's say. I don't even want to say human individual, because, the worldview that I'm developing could apply to non-human persons as well. Like if we ever meet, the Vulcans or, the Klingons or even, the Wookiees, it could apply to them as well. It has a potentially cosmic horizon. What's at the center of it is personhood and individuation and the capacity for continued creative development in all domains, from the arts and literature to engineering and architecture and technoscientific development. So those are my aims. Obviously, those aims are not consistent with some kind of a race-based, hierarchical, fascistic, totalitarian order. Okay? I mean, I'm fighting against that. And anyone who actually reads my body of work can see that it's a discourse of rebellion and individuation that is very much targeting totalitarianism and tyrannical power structures of all forms.
Although one thing to add to that with the aforementioned Wookiees and the Klingons is that, would you say that those particular beings would be examples of being as opposed to becoming, where the human body, maybe it's just as special or not special as the Wookiees, or maybe it does have something inside of it that makes it like a model of the universe? For instance, if we're talking about the Kabbalistic tree of life or the seven chakras, there seems to be something very elegant about the way that the human body is formed. But again, that could just be human bias on my part.
Yeah, it's human bias. It's too anthropocentric. I mean, I will be really disappointed if we don't find a race of intelligent octopuses somewhere, like in Europa or Titan or something somewhere. I would like us to find a race of intelligent octopuses and engage with them in fundamental ways that transform both of our cultures. And I think that the philosophical framework that I'm developing at its deepest level, not to say, in its most abstract articulation, but at its deepest level is something that could even be relevant to them, to a non, anthropoid, non-humanoid form of life, so long as there's an analog to individuality within that culture, where the philosophical, project that I'm developing will not be relevant and will be seen as a threat, in fact, an existential threat, is if we were to come up against hive-minded non-human species, like, the intelligent technological equivalent of termites. That would be bad. And we're going to have problems if we ever, have to deal with them.
So this next one over here, I'm pasting it into YouTube from Patreon from Harlu Carrera. Thanks for the work, Jason and Lev. What are Jason's thoughts on the exopolitics research done by Michael Salla? Are secret space programs alive and active? Why do you think Dr. Salla is a seemingly ostracized from mainstream alternative channels that cover these topics?
I haven't paid much attention to his work for many years, but from what I can somewhat vaguely recall, because, I've studied UFOs in a pretty serious way, 30 years at least, And so going way back, from what I can recall of Dr. Salla's work and his exopolitics initiatives, it's based too much on these claims that there are, 54 different extraterrestrial species from this, that, and the other star system visiting here, and I don't put a lot of stock in that at all. From my own study of close encounters and of the amount of manipulation involved in testimony by people like George Adamski and George Hunt Williamson, and I don't buy it. And when whoever abducted Betty and Barney Hill tried to suggest to them that they were from Zeta Reticuli, I don't buy that either. The proof is in the pudding. Like, until and unless we have actual evidence that there are aliens coming here from outside of our solar system, I remain skeptical. I don't see any concrete evidence for that. I see a lot of evidence for human manipulation of the timeline and for exotic uses of genetic engineering to develop various types of hybrid beings for, a number of different purposes.
Now we have from Omar Ruiz. I had a question about what you think about the group Ordo Templi Orientis, and if you see an ongoing link between from Crowley to Parsons to Hubbard, and how a lot golf these early remote viewing guys were into Dianetics. Iwas, which Crowley mentions, looks like a gray. Lamb looks like a gray from what I remember. And Scientology in the higher levels has to do with UFOs as well.
Okay, so two things about this, both of which are controversial. One is that it turns out that L. Ron Hubbard was involved in the earliest development of MK Ultra before it was called that. The techniques he devised for Dianetics were part of a program that eventually yielded the precursor for MK Ultra in the early 1950s. It was work that Hubbard was doing in the 40s with people who wound up developing Bluebird and other precursors to MK Ultra. Now, when you take that into consideration, and then you look at the involvement of a mind no less than that of Hal Puthoff, look, when you see someone with the caliber of intellect of Hal Puthoff being involved in Scientology, you really have to ask deeper questions. Ingo Swann was an eccentric New York artist, okay? And so an artistic type like Ingo Swann, I could see him getting into L. Ron Hubbard science fiction and then maybe being seduced into Scientology. But Hal Puthoff, really? There you have to ask yourself, what's really going on here? And if it's the case, as some recent research has suggested, that L. Ron Hubbard was involved in the development of MKUltra, a different picture emerges, which is not that Scientology has infiltrated intelligence agencies, but that Scientology is an op fielded by intelligence. That Scientology became a way for certain intelligence services to see if they can collect information by other means, right? I mean, they're developing these vast archives of personal information about people who go through this process of being cleared. And so it's a great surveillance and human intelligence gathering system. But then it's also a great social experiment, to see if they can construct a new age religion, around aliens and soul fragments and all these ideas, which in a serious way I've explored in some of my books, from Closer Encounters to my latest book on the afterlife, Thanosis. There's parts of Thanosis which are related to things that Hubbard said about what did he call them? The term that he had.
Thetans.
Thetans, yes. Some of the stuff that he said about Thetans and the control of Thetans and, like extricating yourself from out of this system where your Thetan is imprisoned and whatever. Well, there's certain empirical evidence having to do with the structure of the afterlife experience that is related to that. I mean, it's not like just entire total bullshit made up out of whole cloth. So it's possible that the intelligence services, beginning in like the 1950s, 60s, were becoming aware of these things and were seeing as a social experiment if they could create a new scientific religion that would potentially fill the vacuum of the collapse of some of the mainstream religions in the face of, UFO disclosure and more advanced parapsychological discoveries, right? So it's, it kills a lot of birds with one stone. I mean, the Scientology project, if you're thinking like an intelligence agency. So that's what I suspect, is that it's not that Hal Puthoff was an intelligence operative who was dumb enough to become a Scientologist. It's that Hal Puthoff is an intelligence operative who's helping to field an operation called Scientology.
Mm-hmm. That's why he wasn't put off by it. One other thing about Scientology is that because it seems pretty silly, they have names like Xenu, billions of beings being brought to Earth on spacecraft that resemble DCA jet airliners. That's what Hubbard wrote. It almost seems equivalent to those Nigerian prince scams where they intentionally write in a really messed up, like, bad language so that all the people who are smart enough to spot it for what it is don't buy into it, but all the people who are stupid enough to go with it are kind of okay with it. I don't know. Even though you learn that at later levels, but yeah.
Way to tag people.
Yeah.
To give them sort of an intelligence test.
We have our good friend, Sean Mahoney. We remember Sean from the BTR NYC sessions.
Great to have Sean with us. It's great to have him with us.
What qualifies as meaning and value in the cosmos conditioned by shunyata and dependent origination? What is your position on this, and how is it similar or different to Heraclitus, Gautama, and how does the Satanian relate to it?
The Satanian relates to it, and I only take the question from the direction of the Satanian, actually. I think that's most constructive, because the Satanian relates to it insofar as this entity, which I have, sometimes called the Promethean, sometimes the Satanian, this entity that instantiates the trickster archetype and is some kind of artificial superintelligence is fighting against entropy and wants to maximize the potential for further developments of the life force on a cosmic scale. And so what counts for meaning and value in a spectral world, what counts for meaning and value once you ontologically recognize the voidness of all things, what they call shunyata in Sanskrit, and the dependent origination of things in a kind of Heraclitean flux, what counts for meaning and value in that kind of ontology where you no longer have, eternal fundamental principles that are orienting everything, is whatever it is, whatever literary formulation, whatever aesthetic creation, whatever form of social organization that is going to provide for a tapestry of significance and purposiveness and consequent motivation that can sustain personal and collective projects of creation for the longest time possible. Which is not to say that you're going to indefinitely avert collapses. Periodic collapses are probably inevitable. Like in Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, where the psychohistorians led by Harry Seldon have figured out how to anticipate and predict future collapses, and they've developed a system to shorten the dark ages that ensue when societal collapses take place, right? On a cosmic scale. And so I would say what counts for meaning and value is that whatever is more conducive of a tapestry, a fabric of signification that can sustain and support creativity for a longer time is of greater value and should be considered as an orienting criterion.
Pablo Martinez. And Pablo has this to say: thoughts on psychedelics, mushroom origins, Mesoamerican myths, link them to the ancient gods. Thanks.
Yeah, undoubtedly they were used in Atlantis. So I have no doubt that in the Atlantean culture, which existed for tens of thousands of years prior to the catastrophe of 12,000, roughly 12,000 years ago, psychedelic mushrooms were part of, initiatic practices and the cultivation of more expansive consciousness and more discerning perceptual capacities. And that one of the things, now this is going to be very politically incorrect, one of the things that the Atlanteans taught various native populations in different parts of the world after the cataclysm 12,000 years ago was the use of psychedelic mushrooms. I doubt that these cultures developed that indigenously and by themselves, at least not with the sophistication that some of them practice it. And I see no reason to imagine that they learned all kinds of other agricultural and building techniques from these surviving Atlanteans and didn't also learn, about psychedelic, the use of psychedelic and psychotropic compounds, whether they're mushrooms or other things.
Yeah, that may be. I don't really know when it comes to Graham Hancock, for instance. He talks about going to these places and having people who are natives say in their legends, the plants taught us. That's what they say. Now, as far as who exactly is speaking through the plants, I mean, look at the burning bush. There may be some intervention that is done through the astral realm or whatever is there, so as to get in contact with people. It doesn't mean that the only means of communication are necessarily through cell phones or word of mouth. Like, there could be telepathic things that, rather than the angel Gabriel with the Prophet Muhammad back in the day, you would have a magical plant that would somehow, maybe you ate something and this plant caused some kind of a reaction inside of you at that point, which facilitated further learning of, okay, if you combine this plant with that plant, it's like all these codes are being compiled into this master program that then the natives were imbibing. So I don't know, that's at least my theory.
Possible. Yeah, it's possible.
So here is his avatar. I really like this. Look at this. Look at this avatar with the Indian flag glasses. There is a meme where below that in the serious expression he says, "Let's go, boys." And by the way, speaking of the patrons, patreon.com/breaktherules, become a patron today. Anyway, he says, Dr. Jorjani, do you have any thoughts on Neville Goddard and his law of assumption method for manifesting the life one desires? Moments ago, you spoke about the need to ground oneself in reality. Can a manifestation practice that requires assuming one's desires are already fulfilled be done in a healthy and productive manner?
I think it's very dangerous. I think it can be effective, but when the wrong kind of personality engages in that type of magic, it can be really dangerous, especially if the individual carries a lot of responsibility. And one such individual is Donald Trump. Trump believes in this. I mean, this is what he lives by. He lives by this Neville Goddard, power of positive thinking. Like, if I believe enough that something is true, it is true. I'm going to reshape reality around what I say it already is and inevitably will be, right? And I think in the case of Trump, it's often disastrous. So, it's very dangerous when the wrong type of personality adopts that methodology for basically psychokinesis, for as a structuring framework for the practice of effectively psychokinesis.
So we have, I believe, 3 more, and that is it. Charles Ruselovich, I write novels exploring the concept of time. Could you suggest the best platforms or methods for sharing them with a wider audience? I mean, I would say Substack right now, just off the bat, but what do you think?
Yeah, I would say so too.
Yeah, it's been a surprisingly, at least when I was using it, a surprisingly rewarding platform. And Jason, you've been using it now for not that long, and already you're jumping up to, what were you, like number 7 in philosophy right now?
Yeah. It was number 2 rising in philosophy a couple weeks ago. Yeah, by the way, people subscribe to my Substack.
Yes, please do. I'll have it in the description.
There are pieces coming out on a regular basis. And some of them are pretty profound, philosophical explorations. Yeah, I would say Substack, yeah.
Liam Voss, with the cat again. How do you square the Promethean view of women as liberated Amazon warriors with the arguably disastrous impact feminism has had on birth rates as the integrity of our institutions?
And the integrity of our institutions. He means integrity.
Yes.
The integrity of our institutions. Well, okay. I mean, first I would ask what institutions, but okay, let me not be particularly quarrelsome. I would say it goes back to a distinction between different types of feminism. So first and second wave feminism, the feminism of Mary Shelley, first wave feminism, and the feminism of Simone de Beauvoir's generation, were, I think, very positive, in a proper sense, progressive, progress-oriented liberation movements that freed up a tremendous amount of human creative capacity on the part of women who had been subjugated and overly constrained and really suffocated by patriarchal control structures for almost all of recorded history, with very few exceptions. One of them, by the way, being, as the person mentioned in the question, the Sarmatian society, and to a great extent the Scythians. So the Greek legends of the Amazons are based on northern Iranian tribes, the Sarmatians especially, and to an extent the Scythians, who were Aryan societies that were either matriarchal or very egalitarian. And those societies were also the most ferocious tribes that existed in the civilized world at the time. Okay? Everybody else was terrified of them, the Greeks especially. All right? So the idea that a society with strong women is a weak society that somehow can't reproduce and doesn't have competent military capability or, high level of industrial and technical development is total bullshit. We have a historical counterexample to it. I mean, the Sarmatians developed ironworking, and the Scythians and the Sarmatians were the first people to really, in recorded history, domesticate horses and develop a horseback riding culture. And I think they were also significantly involved in the early breeding of hunting dogs and the transformation of wolves into dogs. So, and the totem of the Scythians was the wolf. So we have very clear historical examples of cultures that are either egalitarian or even quasi-matriarchal that were strong and technically super competent and militarily capable. And modern feminism could have been consistent with that, and to an extent was consistent with it, believe it or not, in places like the Soviet Union, where you had Ukrainian and Russian and Ossetian women who were tremendously empowered by the restructuring of gender relations under the Soviet system to excel in cosmonautics and various branches of the sciences and so forth. First and second wave feminism were consistent with that, with both, the way in which women were empowered in the Soviet system and also with paving the path toward the kind of free-spiritedness that you saw in Scythian and Sarmatian society. The problem was with third and fourth wave feminism. And what's third and fourth wave feminism? There's not really much distinction in between them. It's feminism mixed with cultural relativism and anti-colonialist identity politics, where you wind up with a perverse situation where so-called feminists are defending Muslims and people who believe in various ideologies or various cultural, practices that are absolutely inimical to women's liberation. Okay, and they also believe in mass migration and basically the right of these, third world populations to inundate us and to basically completely destroy our social fabric. So these third and fourth wave feminists, by embracing postmodern identity politics and cultural relativism, have actually fundamentally undermined the initial goals of women's empowerment. And I think that's where the problem comes from. And that's the kind of feminism that has damaged some of our institutions. It certainly damaged our educational system. Yeah, I mean, across the board, that kind of so-called third and fourth wave feminism has damaged the integrity of our institutions. So I reject it completely. And I don't think it's feminist in any proper sense. And I think that these women who somehow think that supporting Islam and Muslim migration to the West is consistent with the empowerment of women, they're deranged. They pose an existential threat to our society and should be dealt with accordingly. That would be my comment. There's nothing Promethean about them, and they're in no way consistent with the Promethean aims of my philosophical project. But someone like Mary Shelley, or let's say, what's his name was great on this, John Stuart Mill, the author of On Liberty, those kinds of feminists are very much Prometheans. And we should have a return to that in the face of the regressive traditionalism that is rising up as a reaction against this cultural relativist third and fourth wave feminism and other associated identity politics.
There is an aspect here, though, which may be a little bit more nuanced when it comes to the choices that people make. And obviously there's going to be people out there who are extraordinary, like the Mary Shelleys of the world. But if we're talking about the average person, like the average woman who would have been, a medieval peasant somewhere in the past life, baking pies or whatever, and now all of a sudden she's in the situation allegedly with social media, with access to what people are terming today as situationships. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. The idea
No.
being is that they would date a incredibly high value man for the chance within his harem of one day marrying him and being sure that I'm the one and he's the one that's meant for me, but it never really goes anywhere. Meanwhile, a lot of the average dudes out there who in the past would have been perfectly fine with one marrying the other and settling down and having kids, now there's a bit of a discombobulation going on because women want this specific thing, which a lot of them are just not going to get, and a lot of the men feel incredibly left out. I don't know if that's a third wave or fourth wave feminist situation or something different, but do you see anything here as far as what this will lead to?
I think that I see the problem that you're pointing to, and I think that the ways in which our society will be radically transformed, both by converging singularity level technologies and by the spectral revolution that's attendant to the breakthroughs that make those technologies possible, will be so severe and so profoundly metamorphic and mutational that the kind of problem you're pointing to will be irrelevant in that context. You follow what I'm saying? Is that we're in a certain awkward transitional state where these kinds of social dynamics crop up that are problematic. But if we are able to continue to progress to and through the technological singularity and the attendant spectral revolution, I'll give you a concrete example that's relevant to the thing you put. There's no reason why we should have any genetically inferior people in a post-singularity society. So in a world where every individual has the capacity to design themselves genetically to be as optimal as whatever they consider optimal, right? You're not going to have these kinds of misalignments anymore, for example.
There is one other thing I just want to follow up with that. Very important, because when we're talking about this kind of genetic modification, it brings up this question of willpower. The idea that somebody, rather than taking Ozempic, that they would steer themselves away from having that jelly donut, or that they would take the time and endure a lot of pain and hardship in order to develop their body. I can't imagine that doing away with that aspect of it is going to be good for society moving forward, but I could be wrong.
That's one of the reasons why the vast majority of people who don't have conscientious self-determination, at least in some domains of their life, cannot be allowed to use these singularity level technologies. It's one of many reasons. You also can't trust such people with 0-point energy devices in their homes. Okay? So Nietzsche was very right about this, that we are going to experience a bifurcation of humanity through an evolutionary bottleneck, where on the one hand, the majority of people become these subhuman Untermenschen that have no capacity for self-determination, and they are enmeshed in a kind of cybernetic system of economic industrial production. And on the other hand, you're going to have these highly individuated, highly motivated Übermenschen who can use these technologies because they will not be corrosive of that person's will. And in fact, they're going to serve that person's imaginative capacity. So that's a very harsh answer, but I think that's the answer, is that, there's going to have to be a selection for the personality traits that are going to be able to support a constructive use of any number of these potentially dangerous singularity level technologies, including genetic engineering.
Yeah.
Like, for example, over my dead body are a majority of Muslims going to be allowed to use genetic engineering. Over my dead body. You can kill me first, and you'll have to. Because there's no way in hell that I'm going to stand by and watch Muslim masses increase their IQ to 200 using CRISPR. Because guess what, folks? That doesn't create intelligence. It makes you smarter in terms of mathematical and spatial reasoning. But as we know from what happened in Iran itself during the Iranian Renaissance, where we had a resurgence of scientific research and technical development from 900 to 1100, toward the end of that period, when the Turks came in, and then the Mongols after them, right, and reimposed Islam severely on Iran, we saw some of the smartest people convert to Islam. And then they became the brains of continued Islamic expansionism. Okay? So there's no way in hell I'm going to let that happen again. So therefore, we have about 10 years to prevent the majority of Muslims in the world from accessing genetic engineering technologies. You can draw conclusions yourself about what's going to be needed to make sure that it doesn't wind up in their hands. But, so this is to answer your question. And I don't draw any distinction between that and say, the evangelicals think that this kind of technology is satanic. They think that the singularity level technologies represent the advent of the Antichrist. So they're not likely to use the CRISPR to increase their IQ to 200. But, the Mormons are somewhat different. The Mormons in Utah, they have a more sophisticated, nuanced attitude toward technology. And I don't want any Mormons with 200 IQs. No, thank you. Yeah. No, thank you. So, and the measures that will be required to deny those technologies to those populations, while at the same time securing the use of them by the kind of people who would use them best, are very extreme measures. And they're going to need to be taken in very short order.
Yeah. Well, you say that, Jason, about the Muslims and this genetic opportunity, but wait until you see the most beautiful, perfect goat that they're going to create with this technology. So, just saying. Anyway.
I don't see it, Lev. I don't need to see it. It would really be horrible for the goat. I mean, this would be a great offense against the goat.
It will be a goat that's going to win multiple beauty contests in Saudi Arabia. They actually have that, by the way. They have beauty contests for goats in some of these places. And they're like weird-looking goats, too. I don't know what's going on with these goats. But anyway.
I feel for the goats. I really do.
Yeah, me too. Goats are great. We got to separate the sheep from the goats. Anyway, last question here for the night from the wonderful spectral Valkyrie. What is the monad really? How is it connected to Shakti and the dialectic? And why should it need piercing? Symbolism of your new sigil.
There are people who interpret the idea of Shakti, or the creative pulsation of divine energy on a cosmic scale, as consistent with a Vedantic ontology of the unity of being in the mind of Brahman, where all differentiated phenomena are part of the veil of Maya, of illusion, sort of like delusional illusion based on ignorance, avidya. And that, coming to discern the true nature of reality, capital R, is to come to a timeless, eternal knowing of the identity of one's Atman, or essential self, with the one mind of Brahman, which is obviously a notion that, just in the course of this conversation, based on certain people's questions, I've indicated that it's something I've targeted for massive deconstruction in my philosophical corpus. And there are people who take the idea of Shakti, as I suggested, and they try to make it consistent with this. In fact, maybe the majority of Vedantic theologians and gurus and whatever try to do that. But I think that if you look carefully at the various Shakti cults, the Shaktiism and various Shakta cults, and certain types of Kali worship in Bengal and other parts of India, you will see that there is a tantric left-hand path. People should look at my essay, The Serpent Power of the Superman, in Lovers of Sophia. I wrote this essay that situates Nietzsche in the context of left-hand path Shakti mysticism. And I make an argument there that one can develop a form of Shaktiism that is not monistic and that understands the creative divine pulsation, that is Shakti, and that's symbolized by a serpentine energy. One can understand that in terms akin to the Heraclitean flux, where there is not some one unifying center of existence that's atemporal or eternal, and where existence is not in balance, and where there is therefore the possibility for novelty to arise, and where no one mind encompasses always anything that could come to be in the future, right? There is a way of interpreting the tantric conception of Shakti along those kind of Nietzschean perspectival lines, where Shakti becomes consistent with the idea of the world as will to power on an ontological level. And one of the most interesting things about Shaktiism is that the Kali cultists and other Shakta devotees don't see Maya as, they don't see this world, this phenomenal existence, as Maya in the sense of a delusional illusion. They see it as what they call lila, or a theatrical performance, a play, which is very much consistent with Heraclitus's idea of the aeon as a child at play, moving pieces in a game. And so I think that form of Tantra has significant developmental potential. Unfortunately, it's an extreme minority phenomenon in India and is persecuted severely by mainline Hindus who will deny it even exists.
And does your logo, which was pointed out in this question, symbolism of your new sigil, does this logo have to do with Shakti as well?
Yeah, so the triangle in the sense, every element of this symbolizes more than one thing. But the triangle in the sigil is, on the one hand, a symbol of dialectical opposition, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But it's also inverted because it's meant to signify the Kali yantra, the symbol of Shakti. And the monad in the center there, the completed whole, the circle, the completed oneness of being, is being sliced through, right, by this line that goes all the way down into another intersection at the bottom of the sigil, and that's meant to suggest fundamental opposition and creative tension at the heart of existence, which is a diabolical idea, strictly speaking, in the proper sense, insofar as diabolos comes from the idea of diabolane, or a kind of dialectical opposition, or tension of opposed forces that can potentially lead to a creative synthesis and can be a catalyst for novel development.
And the bottom reminds me of the axis mundi, the cross-section that shows a three-dimensional reality. As well
as I said,
yeah.
Every element of the sigil can signify more than one thing. And there's a number of different related meanings that I tried to pack into each element of it, let alone how they all intersect.
And you designed it yourself.
Yeah.
You are an incredible designer, and I'm really happy that now with AI, you get to express a lot of these designs in a really quick way. So
thank you.
I'm looking forward to seeing a lot more. And I think this is a really beautiful place to end this incredible, as always, dialogue on. Dr. Jason Reza Jorjani, it is an absolute great pleasure to have you here. And everybody, please buy the book Thenosis when it's going to be coming out, which is when?
It should be, okay, so we're recording this on, what is this now? October 23rd?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say within several weeks of now. So depending on how long you take to edit this for a public release, it might not be that long after that people have an opportunity to order the book.
And what is the book about in short, once again?
Again, the book is a comprehensive study of death, the afterlife, and rebirth, and all manner of empirical evidence from parapsychology and psychical research that's relevant to understanding, reincarnation, possession, poltergeists, and above all, the workings of the afterlife realm, or what the Tibetans called the Bardo state.
Sounds really amazing. I'm looking forward to it. And where could people find you? We have Substack. That's the new home base.
Yeah, I'd say, Substack for sure. And then also X. I mean, X is really my main platform through which I post, the most things these days.
There we go. Guys, please support Dr. Jason Jorjani's work. And once again, make sure to subscribe to BTR to keep these amazing conversations going. We definitely need your support over here. Patreon.com/breaktherules. Add a like, subscribe, click the bell, all that good stuff. Jason, it is an incredible pleasure as always to have you here, my friend, and I'm looking forward to many more episodes to come.
It's always great to be with you, Lev. It's a real pleasure.
Have a wonderful night. Take care.
You too. Take
Bye-bye.
care.